Okay, we're here today to talk about hurricane lessons. What have we learned from post-Katrina disaster capitalism in NOLA schools? A few people I want to thank. First of all, I thank Netroots Nation for organizing this for us. Folks there are fabulous. This is my 10th Netroots Nation. Every one of them's been good, better than the last one. Also, thank you to the Progressive magazine who helped organize this. Really appreciate the support. And then finally, thank you all for coming. This is a vitally important panel, we feel, at a particularly crucial time, and we're going to explain that. To kick us off today, I want to give a little background. Then I'm going to introduce each of the panelists to you, and then each of them is going to explain their experience, their personal expertise about what happened in New Orleans with the school system here. And then we're going to go to Q&A. So if you have questions, I ask you to please hold them until our experts have given their points of view. Does that sound fair?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Let me start by asking a question. How many of you remember when President George W. Bush tried to privatize Social Security, and Democrats pushed back and won? That was in 2005, 2006. Remember? Okay? And if you're an old Netroots Nation hand like I am, you've been here multiple times and heard people talk about the dangers of privatizing Medicare, right?
Yes.
But what if I were to tell you that there is a movement to privatize a valuable public institution that Democrats and even some progressives don't talk a whole lot about? And when they do, sometimes they're not sure how they feel about it. The public institution I'm talking about that's in danger of being privatized is public education. This week we learned, this is just the latest, of a brand new group called the City Fund that got $200 million from two private wealthy foundations to start a new campaign to convince urban communities across the country that they need to change to a specific type of way of doing school called the portfolio model. The example they point to as being the most successful exemplar of the portfolio model is none other than New Orleans. Columnists in the New York Times have recently written lengthy op-ed pieces praising the New Orleans public school system as a model for the rest of the nation. There have also been op-eds in the Washington Post pointing to New Orleans as the way urban communities ought to be doing public schools across the country. If you look at New Orleans, there's some very specific characteristics about it that these people love. First of all, 95% of the students in New Orleans attend charter schools. Now, when I use the term charter schools and privatization together, some people are not so clear about that because charter schools are often called public charter schools, right? Because they get public tax dollars. But let's be real clear and real truthful today and understand that charter schools are contractors. And so calling a charter school a public school is about the same thing as you would be doing if you called a defense contractor a public company. It's just not completely true, because there are things charter schools, because of their private operations, can do to withhold information or screen certain types of students. They can set their own limits for attendance. They don't have to backfill if students leave during the middle of the year, all those kinds of things. So they are a quasi sort of public-private enterprise. And that's why we use the term privatization when we talk about what's been going on in New Orleans. Now, privatization of schools and charter schools did not start in New Orleans. And it did not start with Katrina. There are examples before what happened to New Orleans. For instance, Philadelphia or Newark, New Jersey. But Katrina is what made the intense level of privatization we're seeing in New Orleans possible. The state leaders in Louisiana set up what was called the Recovery School District. It's a special takeover entity that's established by the state to take over the operations of public school districts that are deemed in emergency. There are similar organizations like this. They use different names in North Carolina, in Michigan, in Tennessee. And also, before the storm hit, the state rejiggered their metrics for how to determine what is an emergency school district, which made New Orleans exposed to the Recovery School District's takeover. So when Katrina happened, everything was set up so that the state could come in and do what it wanted. And the state fired all the teachers, or at least through the school board, fired all the teachers. Over 7,400 staff was let go. Schools were converted to charters, even ones that were ready to open, who had not been damaged by the storm. And another thing that was not changed, though, was a sort of dual separate school system that still continues much to this day of majority black and brown kids attending a certain kind of school, while a certain group of schools that were selective enrollment before the storm hit are still selective enrollment today and are attended mostly by whites. Recently, there was an announcement that the state was going to let the local board take back some control of the charter schools and the school district altogether. But what our panelists are going to tell you today is that there's some special twists to that narrative, and that what is now being billed as the new model for urban schools everywhere is more of a warning sign. And throughout our conversation, I'm going to be pulling out lessons learned for you to take back, because if you were from areas like Denver, Indianapolis, New York City, Chicago, Memphis, this portfolio model that's been put into this marketing campaign is something that's coming to your town if it's not there already. Okay, so let me go over my panelists with you, and then we'll get started. Right next to me is Karen Harper Royal. I've known Karen for years, had her on numerous panels. She's a public school parent, an education activist, and the assistant director of the Pyramid Community Parent Resource Center, where she provides support to parents of children with disabilities. She's a founding member of Parents Across America, a consultant to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and a tireless advocate for students with disabilities. She's also a mean cook, and it's her birthday today.
Happy birthday.
Next to her is Julian Vasquez Heilig. He's an award-winning researcher and teacher and a professor of education leadership and policy studies at California State, Sacramento. He writes frequently at the Public School Shakedown Project of the Progressive Magazine, and his work has been cited in numerous outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Associated Press. Julian's also been on lots of media events, including broadcast from PBS, NBC, Univision, MSNBC. Julian hurt himself playing basketball the other day, so we're really pleased that he could make it, because I know it was a bit of a labor to get here. Ashana Bigard is a fifth-generation and lifelong resident of New Orleans and a mother of 3 children educated in the local public schools. She advocates with the Education Justice Project of New Orleans, does facilitation work through Theater of Solidarity, and writes for the Public Schools Shakedown, that education project of the Progressive magazine. Next to her is Andre Perry. He's a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Project at the Brookings Institution. His research focuses on race and structural inequality, education and economic inclusion, including a recent analysis of major black places and institutions in America and their needs for increased investment. And finally, I neglected to introduce myself. My name is Jeff Bryant. I'm the director of the Education Opportunity Network. That is the education project of the People's Action. I'm also writing and doing editorial work with the Progressive magazine in its Public School Shakedown project. So with that, let's get started. We're going to talk with Karen. We're going to let Karen Harper Royal talk first. Karen, you've probably been in this fight longer than anyone else I know. So why don't you go back and tell us a little bit about what it was like from your perspective, especially as the mother of special needs students.
Sure. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I started this long before Hurricane Katrina. I was fortunate enough to have a son in public school, have 2 sons in public schools. One graduated in 2004, just before Hurricane Katrina, and the second one graduated in 2014. So we had the opportunity to experience both systems. Post-Hurricane Katrina, just as we came back, I was met with my son's public school becoming a charter school, and I was told that transportation would no longer be provided, so I immediately had to file a lawsuit to get transportation. Of course, that did not just affect my child, it affected many children across the city. And as we continued with this fractured public school system, transportation would be a problem, an ongoing problem, and it continues to be a problem for many children in our city. The system became something very difficult to navigate as a public school parent. Parents experienced their children being in separate schools. We no longer had a neighborhood school, so oftentimes charter advocates would say, well, charter schools offer parents a choice. Well, in order to have a choice, you have to have a base to start from. So we didn't have a neighborhood school, so we could say, okay, well, I'm going to stay here, or maybe I'll choose this school over there. That was not the option for us. We had to jump into this fray. The school system only had a few schools that were non-charter. The Recovery School District had a few schools that were non-charter, and eventually all of those became charter schools. So really, we don't have much choice but to put our kids in charter schools because we have no option for neighborhood schools. Parents had to choose from these basically catalogs of schools, if you can get one of these catalogs. So you basically look at the inside here and you see what the options were, and this was for some of the schools. Not all of the schools were in these catalogs. So as you can see, it's a very unwieldy process. Later in the process, they came up with this one app system, which is even more problematic. They made the system worse. Certainly our school system needed improvement, but what these so-called reformers created was something that was much more difficult for people who were trying to recover from a major disaster to navigate, all because they wanted to try out their idea for what would work in public education. Those of us who were here trying to improve our school system had some ideas for how we want to rebuild our neighborhood and rebuild our school system. And many of us tried. I was one of them. Tried to rebuild the school in my neighborhood And then we were forced to make that school a charter school, even though we had gone to many planning meetings for rebuilding our community and the kinds of schools we wanted to be rooted in our community, but we were forced to make them charter schools. The charter school mafia, if you want to call it that, they took over the policy making in our city, in our state, such that really locals had no real say if you wanted something other than a charter. Whatever you wanted in public education, you had to make sure it fit into this charter box. And to me, that's really no choice at all. Parents of children with disabilities, early in the process, it was clear that we were not wanted. The schools were not set up to really serve children with disabilities. Many of these schools were run by people who had never run schools before. They did not have the expertise. They did not have the professionals needed to serve some children with more severe needs. So just like parents of children without disabilities had to navigate the system, it became even more difficult if you were searching for schools that had the services that your child needed. Many of those schools found it difficult to find providers for those services. And because they no longer had the economy of scales, these new schools could not afford the services, and they skimped on services, and children were simply not served well. It got so bad that the Southern Poverty Law Center filed a lawsuit in 2010 to address some of these issues. That lawsuit was not settled until 2015, and a special monitor was put in place to oversee the implementation of a consent decree to try to bring the system into some kind of order for children with special needs. There still continues to be problems to this day. We also had to face the problem of school closing. So once parents went through all of this process to choose a school, oftentimes they would find that their school would close, and sometimes that very next school year. We supported parents of, I remember the Lanyap Charter School. People were wondering, well, why is this person who's against charter schools out there helping these parents whose charter school closed? Well, the bottom line, these are parents and these are children, and they are now victims of what is called a reform. I helped some of these parents when they were standing in the long lines with this one app situation, and just to see those very same parents experience their school closing the very next school year. They chose that school and now it's closing. This is a flawed system when it built into the model is that, okay, if this school doesn't work, we'll close it down. Well, that hurts children. I was a part of an organization called the Coalition for Community Schools, and we ended up filing a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in 2014. That complaint is still being investigated by the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. This process is now being looked at to bring it into Puerto Rico. And I knew when the hurricane hit Puerto Rico that they were going to look to bringing this model there. This is not something that should be brought anywhere because it hurts children at the end of the day. They are studying this, and I think that that's all they wanted to do in the first place was see how privatization would work on communities. And I would say that it doesn't work. Oftentimes when I travel and speak about this, I say that New Orleans is like the canary in the mine, and the canary has died. This is not something that should be exported to other communities because it simply does not work. It destroys communities. And although they say our schools are now coming back to local control, it is a system of charter schools that are coming back. And even though we elect the school board, our school board has little control over what happens. We still don't have neighborhood schools. And when you're trying to rebuild your city, it makes it very difficult to rebuild if you don't have neighborhood schools. We have people who are now choosing to leave New Orleans because they don't want to raise children when they have to get into having to choose a school from a catalog. And once they choose a school, we just had some people choose Cypress Academy only to find just before the school year starts, their school is closed, and then the school district say, okay, well, we'll keep it open, but we still don't know what's going to happen to that school moving forward. That is too much uncertainty. Here we are going on 13 years since this post-Katrina reform has been put in place, and we still have this type of instability in a public school system that is supposed to be reformed with this new model of privatization. It's just not something that is sustainable. It is not something that puts children first, and it's not something that should be exported to other cities. Thank you.
Karen, yeah, that was great. One thing I want to ask you about is I mentioned that the school staff was fired after Katrina. 71% who were African American, 78% who were women. The federal money that was supposed to go to pay for their benefits and wages was sent to as a housing allowance to bring in new teachers from an organization called Teach for America, as well as other similar organizations. And consequently, the experience level of the teaching community, the teaching workforce in New Orleans dropped off severely. Can you explain to people the impact of that on children?
Many of the children, who came back had to face teachers who had little experience. And those teachers, sometimes they would get frustrated and leave before their day was finished. So these children had to face a constant array of inexperienced teachers who did not know how to handle them. They ended up sending those children to timeout rooms. Many of those kids experienced more suspensions. They were not taught properly because these weren't teachers who had the proper teaching credentials. I think the long-term effect on these children, we may never know because that's not what's being studied. They're studying charter schools, but they're not studying the long-term effect on the instability that these children has experienced over all of these years of having this merry-go-round of teachers coming and going, coming and going, coming and going. I think that has to be very difficult for children who had just recently experienced the disaster.
So a lesson learned, I would say, pulling from what Karen has described to us, is that school choice is not a real choice when there's no parent voice.
I would
and
agree with that.
And that's certainly what has happened with the privatization of schools in New Orleans. Okay, Ashana, why don't you bring us up into the present day and talk about your situation, the advocacy work you do. You still have children in the school system.
So hi, everybody. Well, yes, I have 3 children. My children are ages 23, 11, and 7. Don't do that. That's not a good idea. If you're going to have children, have them one behind the other, or be very rich. Choose one. That's just a suggestion. So, oftentimes when I hear people talk about school choice and the New Orleans model, and they talk about what a success it is, I go, okay, well, what exactly is success? So if your goal was to educate children, help a community, create citizens who truly understood their community and electoral process and how to be good citizens in our communities, then no, it was a failure. But if your goal was to break up the black community, break up the black power structure, take wealth from an already poor community, undereducate people, condition and control, then yes, it was a beautiful success, right? It depends on what your goal was. So a lot of times we will often say it was a failure, but no, if your goal was to undereducate, if your goal was to condition and control, if your goal was to make sure you had a population of people that don't know how to unionize, then yes, it was a success. So we have to start asking the question, what was your goal, right? Because clearly if we have 20,000 children in DNF schools, after you've spent billions of dollars and had more than 10 years, and by the way, there's only 49,000 children in the school, so we're talking about almost half of the kids are in DNF schools, then you can't say it's successful. I mean, I don't know about y'all. Again, I'm not a math whiz. But last I checked, when you got a 50 or 60 on a test, that was not a passing score. But I don't know. I guess it depends on what school you go to. But yes, I have a son who's 7, who's on the autism spectrum. I have a daughter who's 11. Both of my children attend charter schools, and also as an advocate, I talk to a lot of parents who will call me and ask me, what are the good schools in New Orleans? How do you choose schools? So I always tell parents, I choose the schools that I feel are going to do the least amount of harm to my children. I do not suffer under the delusion that my children will not be harmed. I just choose the schools that will do the least amount of harm. Because unfortunately, I didn't take my own advice and marry rich, just in case y'all were wondering. But unfortunately, that's the decision a lot of parents have to make in New Orleans. And oftentimes, we'll find ourselves, and I will find myself, working with, consulting with families and friends of Louisiana's incarcerated children, also known as FLIC. I will find myself advocating for parents who might have 3 elementary school age children in 3 separate schools. I had this one case where I had a parent who had a daughter who was 7 in one school and a son who was 5 going on 6 in another school. And the schools picked the children up at bus stops around the same time, which was between 5:50 to 6:15 in the morning. But the bus stops were 8 blocks away from each other. So she had to choose which child she stood with on the corner every morning. And she would put rape whistles around their neck and say, this morning I'm standing with your sister. This morning I'm standing with you. And she would have to watch as her very young child walked away to go stand at the corner by themselves. So this is the kinds of stuff that has real impact on people that people are not taking into consideration. So what she wanted was a neighborhood school so she could send both of her children to, and she wanted to be able to check on her children because both of her children were also asthmatics. And something that's happening in our choice system is people have the choice to decide not to follow the law, apparently. We don't have that choice, but apparently charter schools are magical entities in which they get to choose not to obey federal and state law. Now you might say, Ashana, you're lying. I promise you there are a lot of schools that are not following federal and state law. Because if you have children with severe issues like asthma, heart problems, lung problems, you're supposed to have a medical person on staff while you have those children in that school. The percentages of asthma and chronic conditions in the city of New Orleans, unfortunately, are extremely high. The majority of our charters contract with nurses maybe twice a week. Maybe. So you are not going to have a nurse on staff full time in most of the schools. You're not going to have a true counselor, a therapist. You will have whatever they give you because they have autonomy to choose who they hire and don't hire. So a lot of times it puts our families in peril. We have a lot of special education that's not happening the way it's supposed to, as Karen talked about, because you have a lot of people that are not certified in special education teaching special education classes. And there's a lot of schools you'll go to and they'll just say, well, you know what, we don't know anything about autism. I'm sorry. So could you hire somebody? Well, that's on our to-do list. So you have people operating schools who have what they're supposed to already have on their to-do list is something that they will eventually get around to. Meanwhile, you have children suffering in the building. And again, all over the school district, you have different rules. If you have 4 different children, you have 4 different sets of rules. We have a lot of our children are on free and reduced lunch. Yet we have a lot of charter schools with uniform shirts that range anywhere from $24 to $44. And if you can't buy them, a lot of them will tell you you can't come to school, which is, again, against the law. But, you know, what's the law? So let me wrap that up and finish by saying that, no, this is not something that should be imported unless, again, your goal is to dismantle a city, is to take from the people who already have the least, is to entrench segregation. Because let me say this, we already had a very segregated school system before the storm, but it has gotten worse, much worse. Not only that, but now we have a situation where a lot of local black people can't even get jobs inside of the school system. Like, they will not hire us. And it's not because of our Southern accents. It is because a lot of our locally educated teachers actually do know early childhood brain development. They actually do know adolescent development, and they will tell schools, you cannot do this. What do you mean we're not giving 5-year-olds recess? What do you mean we're doing quiet lunch? That's messing with their social emotional development. That's inappropriate. Anyway, all that to say, that is happening. Again, quiet lunches, no recess, no music, no art, happening all over the city. So when people talk about choice, it's a choice between bad and really, really bad. It's not a choice between good and bad. And most of the few, we have a handful of schools that they'll pull out, Morris Jeff, Bricolage, some other schools that they'll say, look at our wonderful schools, but it's a handful of schools. And most of those schools have at least 50%, not just white children, but middle and upper middle class white children. There's an income segregation that's also going on in New Orleans.
Shauna, let me ask you a question about the issue that I know you deal a lot with in your advocacy work with parents, and that is the suspension issues, the harsh discipline rules in these schools, these charter schools. I'm aware of the research that shows that charter schools in New Orleans have much higher suspension rates for students, particularly black students, particularly students with disabilities, than the other schools do. And could you just tell the audience a little bit more about your experience with that and the trauma that inflicts on schools, on students?
Well, I want to start it by saying that New Orleans children were traumatized before Hurricane Katrina. And when we got back after Hurricane Katrina, the governor proceeded to cut our mental health budget. So people were already suffering with trauma. And then the storm exacerbated that, so you had a lot more people who had trauma. And so what the schools do is they create prison-like environments to deal with trauma. And I want people to imagine you broke your arm. And you go to school, you're like, I'm in pain. And they say, you know what we need you to do? Shut up and sit down and walk on this line, and that's going to fix it. And if you can't walk on this line and keep completely still and track me with your eyes, and some of you are already in trouble because y'all not tracking us with your eyes. I'm just totally going to go into but so we have suspension policies where a lot of it, we have what's called willful disobedience. And of course, disruption of a school process, which is actually an arrestable offense. So willful disobedience is anything I say it is. If you're not tracking me with your eyes, you can get anywhere from a demerit to suspension. If you're not sitting up straight, if you fall asleep, if you have the wrong color belt, if you have an undershirt underneath your uniform shirt that I can see that's the wrong color, I may suspend you. I mean, literally anything. And depending on the school, they will use that, especially with special needs children, because they're trying to push them out. We used to call October 1st dump day, because it was the first day that they got half of their funding for that child. We would see a lot of kids that were expelled from school after that. They had racked up, at the time it was over 3 suspensions. Now you would have people who had 3 suspensions for stuff like talking out of turn, wrong color socks, late for class 3 times. I mean, literally anything, chewing gum, stuff that parents wouldn't believe, because when we chewed gum in school, your teacher would like hit the garbage, that meant come spit it in there, and then you would go sit back down. But also we had an influx of what Karen mentioned earlier, inexperienced teachers from Teach for America who didn't understand the children, didn't understand their culture. They were dealing with a lot of traumatized children. And the schools didn't have real counselors. And even the program we have, Communities in Schools, which is a good program of social workers who come into schools, they're not trained in trauma, which is one of the things that 90% of our children suffer with. They're on that spectrum, from little to PTSD, right? A lot of them are misdiagnosed with ADHD. The reason the medication is not working is because they don't have ADHD, they have trauma. But you have to treat that with a whole curriculum. All that to say, we had schools with like 60 to 70% suspension rates. And right now, we have high suspension rates. But a lot of the schools are not reporting the suspension rates. So what they'll do is they'll say, you know what, Dwayne, leave today and don't come back to school for 2 days. Again, that's illegal. Yeah, if you're wondering, that's illegal. But they do it. They will say things like, another thing is fees. So fines and fees. They will tell parents, we're testing, so we're taking the kids on a field trip. It's going to be $50 a week for the next 3 weeks, and if you can't pay it, just keep your kids home. But they have autonomy, so they believe that's autonomy to do anything they want to do. We've had children suspended and expelled. I mean, if you can think of it, one of the most outrageous cases, one of them, we had a girl who was a junior in school. She had endometriosis, so she bled really heavily. She needed to use the restroom to go and fix, change herself. And she raised her hand. They told her they wouldn't let her go. She kept asking. The teacher said, if you ask one more time, you already have 3 demerits, you're going to get suspended. And if you get suspended one more time, you're going to have to repeat your junior year. So she sat. And it was the beginning of her second 90-minute block. It had the same teacher because the teacher had left. So she had 2 90-minute blocks with the same person, and she just bled all over herself.
Thanks for that, Shauna.
No, I'm sorry. Let me just finish.
Okay.
She was completely humiliated. Long story short, she called her mom to bring her a change of clothes. The mom came. She was still suspended for using her cell phone.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And all that to say, like, that's what's happening in our school system.
Yeah. So I think a lesson I would pull from what Ashana just told us is that separate rules for schools means an unequal education. At least that's what we're seeing from the portfolio model in New Orleans. Next, we're going to hear from Andre. Andre has a kind of an unusual experience. He actually was the CEO of a charter school organization in New Orleans. So, Andre, why don't you tell the audience your experience with that and how that has evolved over time?
Yes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, this is my first Netroots Nation, so I'm happy and proud to be here. So I want to thank those, Progressive Magazine, for inviting me. In my role now at the Brookings Institution, my job is to study cities, particularly majority black cities, and examine what strengths lie in those cities that you can then leverage for future economic and social growth. So I'm looking at people, institutions, systems that can uplift communities. When I was the CEO of the Capital One UNO Charter Network, I got to see and experience what a school system or a school can do for a community. There is no question a school is an instrumental part of a young person, their family's life. It is only a part. At best, a great school can help uplift a child beyond what their parents did at some point. But you also need great transportation, you also need great health care, you also need a good criminal justice system, and you need jobs, certainly. What my criticism has been about education reform in this current movement is that for test score gain, many of my colleagues are willing to give up jobs, willing to give up transportation, willing to give up the other essential goods that uplift children. What was happening in New Orleans, what made Katrina one of the greatest, if not the greatest man-made disaster, was not just education. It was bad policy in policing, bad policy in housing, across the board. And yet, when we measured what works in New Orleans schools, we look at test scores. We do not look at, are we becoming more efficient in getting kids to school? Are kids going to jail less? Are they suspended less? Are they getting special needs services? These were the problems that existed long before charter schools. These are the problems that we need reform for. I argue, just like in New Orleans, just like it is in DC, just like in other places where reform has landed hard, we have reduced the quality of overall quality of life of families. Kids don't live in schools. They live in communities. And as long as reforms don't attend to all of those other structures or help uplift those other structures, we're contradicting ourselves. The firing of the teachers is probably the penultimate example of how we devalue black lives. All the research shows that black teachers add value. Yet in New Orleans, in DC, in other places, when reform hit, when charter schools in particular hit, the black teacher population decreased. We're not going to fire our way to success. We're not going to move the furniture of schools around toward success. Many of the reforms that we see today are predicated on this belief that black people are causing their own problems. So therefore, we can fire them, we can take away their schools, we can take away their districts. Many of the reforms we see today would never happen in a white district. Never. And so for me, it is not about charter schools, it's not about privatizing, because we have a long history in this country of experimenting on black people and with various different, in various reforms. This is about, let's get to the root cause of inequality. Our segregated school systems, our underfunded structures, our suspension and expulsion, or quote unquote discipline practices. These are root causes of injustice. And if we're not addressing those, we're really wasting our time. So my criticism has been, if you really want to see a reform that works, you look for an increase in black teachers, an increase in pay, better transportation, less students expelled. These are the real measures of whether or not you have a successful reform. If your measures mask those inequalities that are currently existing, then it's not reform. It's the same old inequality that's been passed on from one generation to the next.
Let me ask you a question based on that. We're being very critical here of New Orleans in particular, and in a particular variety of reform. But I really appreciate you calling our attention to what we should be doing instead. Is there anybody that's doing it right? Are there any examples of where the types of reforms that you'd like to see, they are being at least considered strongly or put into action?
Yeah, and this is another pet peeve of mine. There are schools that are doing relatively well in spite of the racism that's around them. In New Orleans, believe it or not, there were actually great teachers, great students, great programs They weren't in mass, but I can tell you that many of the well-heeled people, black folk of New Orleans, and many of the not so well-heeled folks went to great schools in New Orleans. However, remember, this is the place where Plessy and Ferguson this is Plessy Ferguson here. It started here. There has always been an effort to give black students the least. This didn't start with Hurricane Katrina and charter schools. There's always been an effort to not provide the resources black children need, and in particular, Louisiana. So for me, again, we really need to see efforts all across the country that build upon the strength of black leadership, black schools, black institutions, black people. When you start a reform and you're not allowing black people to lead, it is not a reform. So there are success. I can go to every single school district and find principals and find district leaders and find programs that are doing well. But the narrative is, and because we measure things in such a way that does not acknowledge black strength, we never recognize and we never invest in black people. So for me, we need to stop saying this district is all bad, as if a wealthy white district is all good. You know, these false equivalencies is really eliminating the ability for us to invest in black leadership, governance structures, people that are doing well in spite of the racism, the structures that would not have them be the best that they can be.
Great, thanks. I think a lesson I would draw from what Andres just told us is that, first of all, it's not the schools, it's the system. And when there are problems in schools, it's oftentimes because the whole system is dysfunctional. And it's dysfunctional because, quite frankly, of our problems with race in this country. Julian, when this campaign is rolled out to privatize schools and follow the portfolio model, it often is accompanied by lots of charts and graphs and studies and all sorts of really smart-sounding language that says this really works. What happened in New Orleans really works, and it'll work for you too. Now, you are one of the best people I know at addressing that issue, and so I'm wondering if that's what you came prepared today to talk to us about.
I think maybe the 8 stats courses I took at Stanford prepared me to answer that question. So let's go for it. But first, I want to first thank the Native people, the Choctaw, the Natchez, the Tunica, for allowing us to be here on their land. I also want to say I'm very sensitive to the fact that, New Orleans is a place of colonization, whether it was the French or later the Americans and other groups. So I'm very sensitive when I talk about this work that I do it in collaboration with people who are from New Orleans. When I wrote a policy brief about this some years ago, I drew upon their work. And it's a real tribute, I think, to the Progressive magazine, that the people that are on the stage are people of color, primarily from this community. So I much appreciate that. So just moving forward here, I have a couple of slides, so I can talk. I want to talk a little bit from them. As soon as I can get this to project, just a moment. Okay, great. So tweet at me. This is Netroots, right? So at Professor JVH. When they say when you're public speaking, you want your audience to come away with a certain feeling. So the feeling that I want you to come away with from this talk is, I want to learn more, right? Because the conversations about charter school and more broadly about school choice as it relates to research is like Alice in Wonderland going down the rabbit hole. There's a lot of information out there, and you have to really do your homework to understand sort of the broad canvas of what's out there in terms of research. So, as we know, Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump are big fans of school choice. Donald Trump promised to spend $20 billion. In fact, a researcher here in New Orleans just received a $10 million grant from Betsy DeVos to study charter schools. So you're going to be hearing a lot more. Now, I think the broader conversation that we're having right now about school reform, it's important to give context. The education reformers are interested in top-down approaches that are about private control and privatization. That is the approach here in New Orleans. That's the approach in Detroit. That's been the approach in Oakland. In many, many other places, it's about top-down reform and about privatization and private control. And here's a couple of examples of that. These are actual pictures from schools. I went on a tour with Karen on her birthday 2 years ago. And these are some of the pictures of the schools in New Orleans that have been abandoned because of the reform that's happened here. So what is the common denominator of these reforms? Is it social justice and civil rights? It's actually about top-down private control and privatization and control of the resources of education. These ideas pre-existed, these retrograded ideas onto them about civil rights and social justice. Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys came up with these ideas of markets and school choice, and then later proponents of school choice attached civil rights narratives to them. One of my other roles, in addition to serving as a professor at Cal State, is I'm the education chair for the California NAACP. So I think very deeply about how these issues are related to civil rights. So now we're going to go to grad school. Just in case you're thinking about your master's or your PhD, I'm going to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty, the research. What we know from the research and what we're seeing here in New Orleans and elsewhere is that charters are even more segregated than are already segregated traditional public schools. A lot of times folks in the charter school sector will say, well, the traditional public schools, they're segregated too. What's really, I think, despairing about charter schools is they take a lot of the issues that we already have in our traditional public schools, whether it be no excuses discipline, whether it be segregation, and they actually make them worse. And so what you see here is looking at the Common Core data from NCES, National Center for Educational Statistics. This is a brand new study. You folks here are actually the first people to see this work because it's currently under peer review, but don't tell anybody. And you watching on live stream, don't tell anybody because it's currently under peer review. So nationally, a higher percent of charter school students attend more intensely segregated school. That's the national data. Charter schools are more doubly segregated, which means they're segregated by race and by class, which you see here in New Orleans. Charter schools are more likely to be segregated even when controlling for local demographics. A lot of charter school people will say, well, charter schools are segregated because they sit in segregated neighborhoods. Well, even when you control for that, you find that charters are 2 to 3% more segregated. So throw that argument out the window for them. A majority of states have at least half of blacks and a third of Latinos in intensely segregated charter schools. Those are schools that are more than 90% Latino or black. At the city level, we also find the same results. So we actually did a special issue on this, the Journal of Transformative Leadership and Policy Studies. I'm giving you lots of homework today. Remember, down the rabbit hole. So accreditation and authorizing, there's a lot of conversations about who should be authorizing charters. Should it only be local or should the state be able to do that? Plessy versus Ferguson, which we know is separate and unequal. We have an interesting piece on that. What does the curriculum look like? Is segregation driven by the fact that knowledge is also being segregated between white charters and charters that serve primarily Latino and black students? And also the implications, the California NAACP president wrote a piece about the implications for civil rights. So check that out. We also find, as Karen talked about, that charters are less likely to serve special education students and other students that have special needs. When you look at it spatially, when you look at it statewide, nationally, that's what the research has been saying for quite some time. And then specifically results, and maybe there might be someone in here that read Doug Harris's study in the last couple of weeks. We can talk about that if you've done that. If you don't, the academics are working to review this study, peer review it. But here's the data in a piece that I wrote. Should Louisiana and the Recovery School District receive accolades for being last and nearly last in almost every academic outcome out there? The RSD graduation rate was last in the state of Louisiana. Only 5.5% of the Recovery School District students who took AP courses scored high enough to get credit. The state-run RSD is 66 in the state of Louisiana and the ACT. So I want to really quickly talk about some alternatives. I'll make it quick, which is that there are community-based ways that we do this. For everything that's about top-down and private control, we have a community-based alternative that's focused on African Americans, on Latinos, on students, so that they're the ones that are empowered by education reforms, not outsiders like me. So does this work? In California, we have something called community-based accountability. It's raised our graduation rates, and it's closed the achievement gaps across the state. A lot of people don't know that California has an $8 billion surplus, $8 billion, and we're investing that money in education right now. So finally, this is not a new debate, actually. W.E.D. Du Bois wrote a piece about does the Negro need separate schools in 1935. So we're actually having the same conversation about charter schools, about should we have separate segregated schools. And so what I did was I used a replacement method that I learned in a summer course taught at Stanford to replace the nouns with the current conversation. I'll read that, and that'll be my closing. This is W.B. Du Bois, and I've replaced some of the language. It means this and nothing more. To sum this, theoretically, the African American needs neither segregated charter schools nor mixed neighborhood schools. What he needs is education. What he must remember is that there is no magic in either mixed neighborhood public schools or in segregated charter schools. A mixed neighborhood public school with poor, unsympathetic teachers with hostile public opinion and no teaching of truth concerning black folk is bad. A segregated charter school with ignorant placeholders, inadequate equipment, poor salaries, and wretched housing is equally bad. Other things being equal, the mixed neighborhood public school is the broader, more natural basis for the education of all youth. It gives wider contacts, inspires greater confidence, and suppresses the inferiority complex. But other things are seldom equal, and in that case, sympathy, knowledge, and truth outweigh all that the mixed neighborhood school can offer. So I think I'll end there.
Thanks. I have a follow-up for you. Thanks for sharing that study about New Orleans with us. As I mentioned earlier, some of these ideas that were showcased as successful in New Orleans have already been tried in some other places.
Sure.
Takeover districts, for instance, portfolio programs. I mentioned Indianapolis, I mentioned Memphis, Washington, D.C. is another, Denver is another. Do you have some advice, some experience that you can share with us, some insight you can share with us about whether or not any of these ideas have been successful someplace else?
Well, I think part of it, and let me be a stats professor just for a second, because when you look at things like the Credo study, which is probably the most prominent charter school research study, they look at national data, they look at local city data, and they'll often say, well, charter schools have a positive impact on kids. But if you look at it really carefully, usually it's in 2 decimal places, like hundredths of a standard deviation, which is, that's a number larger than 0, but barely larger than 0. You need a telescope to see it. So they're actually not lying when they say there's a positive impact of charter schools overall. But if you drill down, like you look in Philadelphia and some of these other places, you actually see that if you look at, for example, African Americans, that neighborhood public schools outperform, like San Antonio, Houston. You look at the Credo study, black students do better in the neighborhood public schools there compared to charters. And so there's regional differences, clearly, but I think it's also important for us to think about the magnitude. In the research literature, there are gold standards that we know work. For example, we know high-quality pre-K moves the needle 400% more than charter schools do. We know that class size reduction also moves the needle 400% more than charter schools, right? So then we have to ask the question that goes back to what Andre was saying, which is that, and really all of the panels, why are we experimenting on our children when we know what works? We know what kind of investments it takes to make those work. What we're really interested in doing is education reform on the cheap by outsiders so that they can profit and privatize on the backs of black and brown children.
That's great. The lesson I would draw from that is that privatization is really a distraction from what we really know what works for kids. So that wraps us up in terms of...
I mean, just real quick.
Yeah.
Privatization is real. There is an an element of reform that truly does not believe in government
Right.
programs. So I don't want to move away from that.
They call them government schools.
Exactly.
Right, right.
You know, and so we just need to be cognizant that black folk need and want great public neighborhood schools. You know, and you know, so I just want to also be clear that, and it was mentioned earlier by all of the panelists, that what we're seeing is not leading to that. You know, and we should always push towards that because we do need change in schools.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. A thought exercise that I often use when I hear somebody running down government, like saying, oh, government schools or
Right.
government housing or government programs, substitute the word democracy for government or democratically controlled. And you can see what it is that this person is really objecting to. Because government is us. And if we're not getting what we want through our democratic process, then that's the problem, and not necessarily that there's anything wrong with government. I just am always flabbergasted by these public officials who will say the problem is the government. You're in the government. So the problem is you? Is that what you're saying? So yeah, thank you for reminding us of that. I'd like to go to Q&A now, and there's a few ground rules. We do not have an audience mic. So that means,
We can repeat the question.
yes, I will repeat the question into the mic, so the people at home or wherever they're watching from can hear the question. But that means you have to keep the questions relatively brief, because otherwise I'm not going to be able to translate it. So, also...
Are we allowing statements asked as questions?
He's a clever guy, isn't he? Also another ground rule is if you want to ask a specific panelist, please let me know, but you don't have to. It can be for the panel at large, and then we'll just take those questions as they come. So you were first.
Thank you. Just before the session started, I told my friend Christine, who lives in Puerto Rico, and told her the session that I was going to.
Yeah.
And I asked her thoughts, and then suddenly the session started. She sent 3 sentences, and maybe you can just read them. And
Sure.
one of the words I'm not really all that familiar with, so I'd ask for any thoughts on that.
Okay, this is very interesting. This is a comment from somebody in Puerto Rico, where, as we mentioned, there's a privatization endeavor certainly rolling out after Hurricane Maria. Puerto Rican schools are suffering from this. It is awful. Whatever they can say, in terms of our panelists here today, to create alliances, I am happy to pass on through several strong networks fighting austerity and school closures. So thank you from Puerto Rico.
Do you want me to comment on that? So Jeff actually asked me 2 years ago to write about Puerto Rico in the Progressive magazine. So check out my article about Puerto Rico in the Progressive magazine. They're after the same thing there. Charter schools, closing schools, making kids walk or have quite, there's quite a distance to their school. You see that same sort of approach here in New Orleans, where kids have to get on the buses really early in the morning and they come home really late. There's a playbook, folks. There's a private control and privatization playbook that they roll out. I call it the privatization cabal. And what's interesting about this is that there's some characters in this. I'm going to be honest, there's academics that are part of this cabal. There are large foundations that are part of this cabal, the Broad Foundation, the John Olive Foundation, Walton Family Foundation. And then there are also, Wall Street is a part of this cabal. And Wall Street is a big part of what's going on in Puerto Rico, because they're the ones that own the debt of Puerto Rico's debt and are demanding these austerity and specifically requiring that they privatize and offer over, they call them, I think, leader schools. They don't call them charters, they call them leader schools there. And so Wall Street is really, and they imported an education reformer from the United States to run the education reform work on the island. So I know that the teachers are very concerned about this. We've communicated with them, and I think that we're very willing to partner and ally with them.
And just so your friend knows, Community and Just Schools Funds is doing a learning exchange between Puerto Rico and New Orleans. And so we're actually going to be headed to Puerto Rico in October. But please tell your friend if she like to connect, to contact me. My Facebook is literally Ashana Bigard. My Twitter is Ashana Bigard. Like it's, and I would love to see how we can definitely work together to help. Again, and that's Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, FLIC, and Community and Just Schools. I'm sorry, FLIC, it was just FFLIC, and also Families and Friends of Louisiana's Incarcerated Children, but FLIC is the acronym. And Communities for Just Schools Fund is doing a learning exchange between New Orleans and Puerto Rico because we understand the connections, and we understand that they're trying to duplicate this. And this has not been good for our community, and it has not been good for our children. So anything we can do to help, we want to.
And also just a somewhat bigger picture analysis. I've had people in various panels ask me, how can we get another Hurricane Katrina in my city? You know, and it's really that, one, disasters break up social networks that are powerful, that enable folks to come in and quote unquote disrupt and build things that they would never be able to do under any other circumstance. But there's also the potential of folks creating not a hurricane, but using an economic crisis, using a social crisis to insert a reform that would never in other circumstances exist. And so, yes, people are looking for opportunities to come and insert various reforms in cities all across the country.
And lastly, I would say is that people on the island should be unified. Don't allow this reform to divide up your community. Understand that this is snake oil, and no matter how they package it up, it's not going to be something that's going to be good for the community, so everyone should band together to resist it. It's not going to be good.
Andre's comment reminds me that the Secretary of Education in Puerto Rico, her name is Kelleher, made the very same comment that Hurricane Maria was good for the schools there. I'm also reminded that Arnie Duncan, Barack Obama's Secretary of Education, said Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to New Orleans. Okay, you were next.
I have a question about the money.
Okay.
Because I'm in Washington State, where we had several billionaires who pushed these ideas on elsewhere and have been slower to get it in Washington State, but continue to push it. And one thing we have right now in Seattle is 1 in 12 of our kids are homeless right now in Seattle public schools. And so it feels like kind of the intersectionality, they have manufactured a crisis by so chronically underfunding so many other programs so that they can continue to push the privatization and charter school movement in Washington State and in Seattle.
Okay, I think briefly, you're asking our panelists to respond to the issue of how underfunding of schools has contributed to this campaign to privatize schools.
Yes, it seems like there's kind of natural crises or then the manufactured crisis.
Yeah.
The manufactured crisis of that. Perfect.
Well, I think there's a clear, and this is Julian will appreciate this, there's a blaming of the effect and not the cause. You know, in research, we constantly asking people to understand the difference between causation and correlation. And people are looking at the effect and then using whatever reform to say, this is the reason why we should come in, without looking at the root cause of things like homelessness, joblessness. And sometimes it's those very wealthy individuals that are accelerating those other issues. So, I always say, let's keep our eye on root causes of reason why students are not are underachieving in school. And it's not necessarily because of the school. It's because of they're living in communities that are constantly devalued in every aspect of their life.
Yeah, and I think one additional piece to that is I went into the Lion's Den 2 weeks ago. I went to the big libertarian convention in Las Vegas. They invited me to be in a mock trial defending education. And one of the points that I made to them is that they just believe that if we change the governance of the school and who makes money off of a school, that magically kids will do better. I mean, that's the core principle of what, and that people would choose, right? I could choose McDonald's, but that doesn't mean it's going to be good for me, right? So the thing is, it goes back to what Andre said a few minutes ago, which is that we have to think about how to address the challenges in those kids' lives. And one of the ways we're doing that now is in the community schools movement. There's a lot of research that shows if we provide that support to those kids, address the homelessness, address the hunger, address the socio-emotional challenges. Charter schools think that they can just take the kids in, test prep them, and then everything will be fine because they'll show test score improvement. We have to think about how charter schools do this, how traditional neighborhood public schools, how we do this in a way that addresses the needs of the kids that come to us. We can't just skip over and think that if we change the governance, that magically kids will have better lives.
And can I say something real quick? We also have to have the right people doing that, right? Because a lot of times you will have people go in to help, and who are very well-meaning, but their immediate assumption is that there's something wrong with these children in their communities, right? So if I go in looking down at everything you are, everything you come from, your culture, I'm going to fix you. And let's be real, let's call it what it is. I'm going to fix you and make you more white and more acceptable to white culture, right? I'm going to whiten you up to fix you. It won't work. So, and our schools were underfunded. I was in a class of 45 kids with one teacher and no AC, who, by the way, did the best she could, and she was a damn good teacher. But every teacher can't flourish in a kid with 45 kids. And one other thing, we had $76 billion coming to New Orleans after Katrina, and the Black Native population has 18% less wealth. So if that's the success you wanted, was to take land and money and wealth away from the Black Native population, well, clearly you got that. But if that's not what you were going for, yeah.
Yes, here, and then I'll go to the back of the room.
So I'm like you, Sean. I have 4 kids who range from 22 to 8, and I live in Santa Monica, but I have my oldest son in LA Unified and my youngest 2 in Santa Monica Unified, and I have my oldest daughter in charter schools. But there's been a shift in charter schools because when she started out in a charter school, I chose it because it was an African-centered charter school, and most of the charter schools in LA at that time were run by people that looked like us, and they were teaching, the curriculum was centered around us, and then it started to shift, and other people started coming in and taking over. But, so I had to remove her and do something different, and I had to move my son from Santa Monica, 17-year-old, from Santa Monica Unified to LA Unified and put him in Dorsey so that he can go to a school with people that look like him. But my question is for you, Julie.
Okay.
I work for LA Unified.
Okay.
And you're from California.
Sure.
As you know, I'm sure you know that they just hired Austin Rubin,
Brody.
who
Yeah.
is pro-charter.
Yeah.
And you know that we are the second largest school district in the nation.
Because Ref Rodriguez, who was laundering money, was the deciding vote to bring him in. Yeah.
Yes, so in LA Unified, we're all looking at this as if LA Unified breaks up and they get what they want and are able to privatize
Yeah.
LA Unified by becoming charter.
Sure.
And he's also pro-homeschool.
Sure.
What is that going to do to California?
Okay,
this-
let me summarize it for our audience
Okay.
watching on the live stream. The questioner was talking about the situation in Los Angeles, where the new leadership is inclined to a New Orleans type model or something similar. And her question to Julian, quite specifically, is what is going to be the consequences to a huge district like Los Angeles?
Yeah. And the consequence, so this is one thing we haven't been talking about, which is what does this look like in 5 years? What does our education system look like in 10 years? And I think LA Unified is a preview of that. So a recent study there found that charters were costing the district $500 million. So let me be the economist for just a second, which is that hurts the economies of scale. The district still has to provide busing. They still have to provide food services. They still have to pay into the teachers' pensions, et cetera, et cetera. But now they're doing it with $500 million less. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that California has, I think LA Unified has had an increase in funding by about 16% because of the local control funding formula. Jerry Brown has been spending money on education gangbusters in our state. I mean, Cal State just got $400 million more for what we're doing in our system, right? And so, but without that extra infusion of money, you would see a march towards bankruptcy. If you look at the hometown district of my parents, Saginaw, Buena Vista, with little north of Flint, Michigan, the charter schools put the traditional district out of business because they couldn't run anymore. And that was the original goal of people like Milton Friedman, is that school choice will put public schools out of business and that they'll be run by private, either nonprofit or, as in Michigan, for-profit companies, right? And so that's where we're headed in LA Unified. That's where we're headed everywhere as we march towards more and more charter schools. The districts are not going to be able to stay solvent.
Okay, we've got time for just one more question. All the way at the back there, you've been holding up your hand a long time.
Hi, I teach right next door in Jefferson Parish, and I just wanted to have the panel, Professor Shana, talk about some of the ways that teachers and sort of organized teachers and labor can work together in the fight against charterization, so sort of like, you know, communities joining together and ways that can be pushed forward against this, this attack on public education.
Excellent question. Our last question is, a New Orleans teacher wants to know how teachers and other people in the community can work together to fight back against what's going on here and what's going to be going on in other communities.
Real quick, I want to say definitely teachers need to come together, especially when there's a violation of labor laws, which is happening all across our city. Teachers are not getting lunches. They're not getting planning time. They're not even getting breaks for the bathroom. So when this is happening, you have to come together. You can't let one person go in and be picked off. But again, if you come together and say, and report the violations and labor law violations, which are happening all across, get in touch with the union. But definitely, even if you're not going to go for the union, which I suggest you do, come together, and get with the parents, because the parents do not know what's happening. They do not know you're being mistreated, because I'm upset my daughter didn't get a bathroom break. But if I understand that not only is she not getting one, you're not getting one, I'm going to come and support my child's teacher. So please, teachers, come together, get together. When you're being screamed at as part of your training and being told this is how you talk to children, and I'm using this actually happened. Teachers were marched up and down the hall, screamed at, told to keep their arms by their sides, don't put their hands in their pockets. And this is how they should talk to the children. When this is happening, come together. Let the parents know what is happening. Let them know that you're being told to scream at their children in a way that you wouldn't scream at a dog. Yes, we want to come together. We want to help. And even in high schools, the students will have your backs. But we have to come together, and we have to be collective and speak up.
Can I? Oh.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're seeing all across the country, teachers are mobilizing, and this can be an issue included with teacher pay and other work conditions. I will say this, and I'm going to challenge my union folks. Remember, there are significant unions that are racist, and they have been mobilizing for a long time and help contributing to what we see today. So as you mobilize, make sure that there is an anti-racist core to your efforts, because what you don't want to see are teachers rallying behind things that are antithetical to the progression of black and brown children, for sure.
And I think just really quickly, there's a session tomorrow that AFT is holding about the Educator Spring, and that's at 4:15 tomorrow. And the other thing, and then I'll shut up. This conversation doesn't have to stop here. We're all very avid users of social media, so you can reach out to us, tweet at us, and we will always respond. I even respond to the trolls and the haters.
And I just want to add, as Ashana says, come together. let the parents know, organize with the parents. Because if you think about it, with this equation, parents and teachers together are 2/3 of the equation, the education equation, the school district, the parents, and the teachers. So parents and teachers organizing together would be a strong unit.
And I'll close out by saying that there will be an education caucus here at Netroots Nation, 4:15 Saturday afternoon. So you can come there and meet people who are organizing for education around the country. Okay, we're out of time. I'm sorry I could not get to all the questions. I want to give our panel a good round of thank you for coming. And thank you for being an excellent audience, too.
And let me shout out Community Book Center. They have a stand downstairs. I have to shout them out because they used to get the contracts for our school books. They don't anymore. Go see Mama Vera, Black, female-owned Community Book Center. Please, if y'all gonna buy books or y'all know people buying them, go see Mama Vera. She's down there.
And I'd like one last shout out as well. If you want to know more about this takeover, aperfectstormthemovie.com.
Yep.
That is a series of videos that I co-produced with Dr. Renard Sanders and Phoebe Ferguson about the takeover of New Orleans public schools. aperfectstormthemovie.com.
And Public School Shakedown. Please read us all on Public School Shakedown. We have a ton of articles. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Great job, everybody.
My birthday on it.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
Oh my God.
Uh-huh.
It might be the only place crazier than Louisiana.
Oh yeah, the Norman.
You know the charter school? When you pay for the charter school, when they're finished paying
No, they
for the
pull it
building,
back.
the person who started the charter school gets to keep the property first. So basically, we're paying for their retirement.
Late last night on You're welcome. Yes, a long way away. You got a long way away.
I got
Yeah.